Hello, comrades, and welcome to another video on the Russian Revolution Area of Study 2. In this video, we're going to be looking at the new economic policy introduced in 1921. Now, here's a great quote from historian Martin Macaulay, who I don't think we've heard of before, but historian Martin Macaulay is quoted as saying, if war communism was a leap into socialism, then the NEP was a leap out of socialism. So that might give you a slight hint at what the new economic policy may look like. First of all, a quick recap of our last video. So peasant uprisings occurred after the Civil War ended, most notably the Tambov uprising, but these were crushed by the Red Army. The Kronstadt Rebellion was an anti-Bolshevik uprising that broke out among soldiers and sailors on an island fortress close to Petrograd. These sailors had previously been staunch supporters of the revolution, participating in unrest in the capital in 1905 and October 1917. However, in February 1921, they formed their own Provisional Revolutionary Committee and drafted an extensive list of political and economic demands in response to Bolshevik suppression of workers' protests and continued grain requisitioning. The Bolshevik response was swift and brutal. Waves of Red Army units attacked the island, and the Kronstadt rebels were eventually forced to flee. Around 2,000 were captured, actually more than that, and most of whom were executed. So that's a quick recap on the Kronstadt Rebellion and peasant uprisings. Now, first, let's contextualize the new economic policy. So here's a great quote from Lenin. What is needed now is an economic breathing spell. So basically, everyone just needs to take a deep breath. We need to get back on track after the Civil War and after war communism. So by early 1921, the Soviet regime had been rattled by the Kronstadt Rebellion, peasant revolts in the provinces, angry food queues in the cities, strikes by hungry workers, and factionalism within the Communist Party. If conditions did not improve, then the Bolshevik regime faced the possibility of another revolution. On the 8th of March 1921, so this is one day after the first assault on Kronstadt, if you'll remember from our last video. So 8th of March 1921, at the 10th Party Congress, which our next video is going to also be about, Lenin responded to these challenges by winding back war communism and relaxing Soviet economic policy by introducing the new economic policy, or the NEP. According to Lenin, the national economy must be put back on its feet at all costs. The first thing to do is to restore, consolidate, and improve peasant farming. The essence of the NEP was, number one, restarting private trade, and number two, relaxing centralized state control over the economy. Let's have a look at the key features of the NEP. Now, I do want to draw your attention. In your textbook, there are some great graphics, particularly on page 246 and 248. So please do have a look at those when you are revising about the NEP. But here are some key features. So with regard to farming, grain requisitioning was replaced by a tax in kind. The reason it's called a tax in kind is because it wasn't a monetary tax. Instead, it was a tax in crops and goods. Peasants were allowed to keep their surplus grain and sell it on. So whereas previously there was no selling, no private trading, now they were allowed to keep surplus as long as they'd already paid the tax in kind and sell it to make extra money. There was no tax for the first year for famine-affected areas, and the tax in kind changed to a regular tax in 1924 once the economy had stabilized. In terms of cash, rationing and food distribution was phased out. State-supplied services was also phased out. Cash wages were reintroduced, and there was a new currency backed by a gold standard, which was launched, and the hyperinflation that was purposely brought about during war communism was brought back under control. So cash was a part of Russian economic society once again. Trading. markets and private trading was now legalized, so there was no more, private trading happening on trains and black market trading taking place. So that was now legalized. Small businesses could reopen. Some smaller factories were leased or sold to private owners, so private ownership became a part of society once again. Economic ties with foreign nations slowly resumed, and the first foreign trade agreement, was with Britain, signed in 1922. This was followed by other trade agreements with other countries. In terms of working conditions, the militarized aspects of workplaces was abandoned, particularly with labor armies. The economy was still subject to government control, and significant sectors of the economy remained under state ownership. So there was still, it's not like they went completely back to a capitalist system. The government still owned and controlled many industrial sectors. However, lots of private business and private ownership came back into the Russian economy. This, as you can imagine, caused some disagreements within the party. So hardliners in the Communist Party viewed the NEP as a retreat towards capitalism, or at least as an acknowledgement that socialist policies had failed. Lenin responded by justifying the NEP as a temporary measure. He argued that the NEP was intended to provide a breathing space for the Russian people and their economy. He declared that while elements of petty capitalism would return, the Soviet government retained control of industry, mining, heavy manufacture, and banking. Now, we can see an example of continuity here from pre-communist Russia, when we say here that much like Stolypin's land reforms of 1906 and 1907, the NEP encouraged and increased class divisions by allowing some peasants to enrich themselves. Bukharin, actually, a few years after the launch of the NEP, was quoted as using the term enrich. He said, "We must say to the whole peasantry, to all its strata, enrich yourselves, accumulate, develop your economy." Now, that didn't go down all that well with many within the party. Stalin definitely was opposed to Bukharin's views, and Bukharin withdrew that statement. However, the NEP did provide a basis from which peasants could enrich themselves. Now, the NEP disillusioned many young Bolsheviks who were eagerly awaiting the transition to socialism. Here is a quote from Alexander Barmine from 1921. He wrote, "We felt as though the revolution had been betrayed and it was time to quit the party. If money was reappearing, wouldn't rich people reappear too? Weren't we on the slippery slope that led back to capitalism? We put these questions to ourselves with feelings of anxiety." So definitely there was not wholehearted support for the move towards the NEP. In terms of effects of the NEP, by 1926 and 1927, production output in most industries had steadily increased, though production levels were uneven between different industries. There were positive gains in manufacturing and light industry, oil exports, and electricity. That's going to be a future video on the Communist Party's sort of obsession, particularly Lenin's sort of obsession with electricity. So there were definite gains in those industries. However, there were losses in heavy industry and also in iron ore, or at least not the same level of gains made. The NEP reduced worker and peasant discontent. So that was one of the main goals of the NEP. So that was definitely a big win. Strikes steadily decreased from 1922 onwards. When they recovered from the famine, the peasantry made considerable advances. So the peasantry really made some positive advances. Grain production rose to pre-World War I levels. Livestock numbers were higher than pre-war levels. Peasants started using a farming method known as crop rotation to improve soil quality. As such, there was a greater range of crops grown. Production of potatoes, cotton, and sugar beets all increased. And the rural sector, as a result, started producing more than the manufacturing sector. And by the mid-1920s, most peasants were actually better off than they were before World War I. So there was a huge turnaround for the peasants, from the Great Famine of 1921 to now being better off than they were before the war. Which leads us on to the scissors crisis. So in 1923, with factories still struggling to produce enough goods to sell to the peasants, while the countryside and the peasantry had recovered, prices for manufactured goods remained high because if you think about the concept of supply and demand, there was low supply, which means high demand, which means that the prices were high, while the price of grain, there was high supply, so low demand, so the price had dropped. So the price of grain dropped and the price of manufactured goods was high. There was a fear that this, you can see that here in this graph. So around 1922, agricultural prices were actually higher than manufacturing prices, industrial prices. By late 1923, there was a huge discrepancy with agricultural prices much lower than industrial prices. There was a fear among the party that this would lead the peasants to start hoarding their produce again in a bid to drive prices up. Trotsky figuratively compared this widening gap between industrial and agricultural prices to an open pair of scissors that needed to be brought closer together. As such, the government introduced price controls in the industrial and manufacturing sectors to close the blades, so to speak. So that's what you can see here as the prices come closer together in 1924 and 1925. Now, in terms of historical interpretations of the NEP, we'll have a look at Sheila Fitzpatrick. She said, many communists felt deeply disillusioned. It seemed that the revolution had changed so little. Robert Service said most Bolshevik leaders had never liked the NEP, regarding it as an excrescent boil on the body politic and at worst a malignant cancer. An excrescent boil means like excrescent is like a protruding thing coming off of someone, so like a boil. So basically he's saying here that the Bolshevik leaders saw the NEP as a nasty, gross sort of cancer that was part of the society that they had to just live with. Now, the official history, the CPSU, which was commissioned by Stalin and published in 1938, described the NEP as a temporary but necessary step backwards in order to ensure the revolution survived. So I hope you found this video useful on the new economic policy. We started this video when we first introduced the new economic policy. I mentioned the 10th Party Congress, and in our next video we'll find out some of the other changes that took place at the 10th Party Congress in March 1921. So I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you next time.